All right, everybody. I think we can get started. Um, we're going to begin the session. I'm going to get out of my full screen with our full group um, in our social distancing parallel session. We have Ben Braun, who's, I believe, sharing his screen now, and the group has a presentation entitled A Simple Agent-Based Model to Explore Virus Dynamics. So you have 10 minutes, and if you're ready, you can go.
All right, great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, so our group is the Agent COVID group. This is me, Ben Braun, Bashak Taraktas, Brian Bekage, and Jane Malofsky. And we are talking about using agent-based models to investigate social distancing as a control method. So, uh, so one of the things we talked about was the idea that a black swan event is one that comes as a surprise and has a major effect on humanity, and that there have been many different black swan events in history, sinking the Titanic and the Fukushima accident and many other things. And certainly COVID-19 qualifies as this not expected and massive impacts. And so we were really inspired by the first tutorial in the series with three particular aspects. The first being the importance of heterogeneity in the model. The second being the importance of individual behavior, and the third being the role of agent-based models and empirical simulations. And so inspired by this, we wanted to develop an agent-based model to examine the spread of the disease under different levels of social distancing measures, and to understand how network structure and infection size influence disease spread. And I want to point out that what we're doing here is definitely toy models. These are not based on real world data, at least as of the moment. And so this is our goal. So just to be clear, an agent-based model is one in which we have a network and individual nodes or agents. They have characteristics, and those characteristics determine at each time step how it is that the agents interact with their neighbors. And so the network types that we considered were two that are just stock models in NetLogo. One is a spatial network, which is illustrated here on the left, and on the right is a Watts-Strogatz small world model. And so these are the two network types that we considered. We built a NetLogo code, and there's a lot of different input data that goes into our model, but the model essentially works in the following way. Every agent carries a certain pathogen level, and once that pathogen level exceeds a certain value, then they become infected. And infected people then shed different levels of pathogens to their neighbors depending on how infected they are. And so there's a lot of different variables that we built into the model, but the ones that we considered were both the spatial networks and the Watts-Strogatz small world networks. We varied the initial outbreak size. We varied the average node degree, also known as irregularity. We varied the percentage of the population that was social distancing. And then the last thing that we varied was, I just have to remind myself what it was, let's see, average node degree, initial outbreak size, social distancing threshold, and what else? Oh, an average node degree. I guess I said that. Anyway, outbreak population, social distancing percentage, and average degree. So what we have here are plots where we're showing for a network with a fixed number of nodes, 300 nodes. Each of these plots corresponds to a different average degree 2, 4, 6, 8, and so on future slides. On the y-axis is the total number of infections plotted against the duration of the infection on the x-axis. So the x-coordinate will tell you how long the infection took to burn out in the community, in the network. The y-axis will tell you how many of the nodes ended up infected. Yellow is strong social distancing. The dark purple is very little social distancing. Green is moderate amounts. And then the size of the initial outbreak population is denoted by the size of the dots. So what you can see is with a spatial network with a small average degree, then you really do have a spread in terms of the total number of people who can be infected, which is the values on the y-axis. You have a spread in how long the infection can take, which is the y values. You do see that if you have a high percentage of people practicing social distancing, which is the yellows and the light greens, those tend to have a small total number of infections and a small duration of infection. When you have very little social distancing going on, this is the dark blue and purple, then you have many more people infected. It also burns through pretty quickly. However, when we increase the average degree, then you see that there's this thresholding effect that takes place with the social distancing measure. So with smaller amounts of social distancing, we see that almost everyone gets infected. Very little social distancing, people get infected very quickly and the duration is short. As you have more moderate but still low amounts of social distancing, everyone gets infected, but it takes longer. And with very high social distancing, you see a sort of similar behavior. Lots of social distancing are low infections, short time, and it goes out a little bit. And this, it's more sparse in the middle, showing that thresholding. The small world networks, again, with the low average degree, you more quickly start to see this gap. And with high average degree, this becomes really pronounced, where at some point, where we have not quantified this yet, but at some point, you really do hit where with below a certain threshold of social distancing, you're going to see everyone get the infection. And depending on how strongly you're adhering to social distancing, this takes longer to burn through the community. With enough people social distancing, then it really is contained, even if it takes a little while to burn out. So our conclusions thus far is that we do seem to observe this thresholding behavior. We have not yet done enough models. So we ran around 2,400 experiments for each type of network. We plan to do further experiments where we vary many more of those parameters to try to get a better sense of how this thresholding functions and what variables are playing roles. We also would like to model our initial outbreak sizes on different real world data, for example, from the Johns Hopkins COVID-19 status report website, where we still are using toy models, but informed by real world data. And so I will stop there and take questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks. If you have any questions, you can type them now into the chat and I'll read them aloud. And if you don't have any questions, then we can move on to the next presentation. All right. Okay, well, if you want to type some questions into the chat, maybe oh, here we go. So we have a question from Nicholas. Can you explain the social distancing implementation again?
Yeah, so for this particular models that we showed, at each time step, there was a certain chance that any given agent was socially distanced. So if the social distance was 60% chance, then we'd pick a random number. If it was below 60, then they social distanced, and above 60, they did not. And that was done at each time step. We do have other ideas in mind.
Great.
Yeah, and then Lewis, the threshold conjecture, we don't have a specific conjecture yet. We just think there is a threshold, and we would like to figure out what it is and what variables it's dependent on.
And then I think we have time for this last question. So they want to hear more about the viral charge and how that was parameterized in the model.
Yeah, so with that, each individual had a given pathogen level. The infected individuals had a random amount of pathogen to start out, but enough to be infected. And then depending on how high the pathogen level was, they were either guaranteed to be symptomatic, or if it was a more modest pathogen exposure, then they had a chance of becoming symptomatic and a chance of staying asymptomatic. And what we meant by social distancing was that they did not communicate with any of their neighbors. No pathogens were transferred for that individual. We removed
Great,
all
thank you
edges.
so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nick, if you could share your screen. Great. Thank you so much for that last presentation. It was really great. Next up, we have Team Animus, and they'll be presenting a talk entitled Lockdown Forever, Exploring the Effect of Social Strategies on COVID-19 Epidemic Dynamics. And so our screen share, Nick, is ready to go, and you can take it away.
Thanks so much, Juniper. So our team is comprised of Sanjukta Krishnagopal, myself, Joe Farron, and Stephanie Raja. And we're exploring the effect of basically lifting social restrictions with different social distancing strategies. So first, I'd like to go into our model. We considered a toy network model, and we, on each node, considered a multi-state model where you can be susceptible, exposed, asymptomatic, recovered, symptomatic, aka infected, or dead. In addition, we implemented social distancing on the network by cutting edges over time. So to talk about our epidemiological model, we used this multi-state model, as I mentioned, with susceptible, exposed, asymptomatic, and symptomatic states, as well as recovered and deceased. This is a stochastic model. And so we used parameters that we found in the literature. So we said that the mean time that you spent in the exposed class is 2 days. The mean time that you spent in the asymptomatic class before transitioning to being infected is 3 days. The mean time that it takes for asymptomatic individuals to recover is 12 days. And then the mean time for recovery is 15 days for symptomatic individuals. Now, we noted that we expected symptomatic individuals to recover 98% of the time. And then if they didn't recover, we concluded that they had died. So also to describe our network model, so for computational purposes, we used a network of size 5,000. We would have chosen something bigger, but again, the computational cost. It had mean degree of 15, so 15 neighbors average for each node. And then we used a network generation model called the LFR model, and it basically simulates an artificial social structure. And you can vary the sizes of communities as well as inter-community connections. And then the way we implemented social distancing was at each time step, depending on a certain strategy, we would modify the edges of the original network. And then we simulated the epidemic on the network as a Markov process for most of the transitions, but then we assumed that the recovery was going to be normally distributed. So we considered 6 different social distancing strategies. The first one is you just don't distance, and so it's business as usual. And then the second one was random widespread social distancing. So in some sense, you don't pick the specific edges or nodes, you just randomly reduce the number of edges by 50%. You can quarantine the symptomatic, so you figure out who's infected and then reduce their contact by 85%. We also implemented contact tracing, so you figure out who you're friends with that are infected, and then you reduce your contact by a certain percentage. We also isolated the most highly connected people, so reducing their contact by 75%. And then the other and last strategy we considered was to distance based on the number of infected. And you can think of this as more of a reactive political strategy. So it's popular to shut things down when there's a high level of cases, but when things start to die down, it makes sense to lift restrictions again. Another thing that we plan on exploring in the future is, for this study, we looked at degree centrality, but you can imagine that that only accounts for your immediate friends. It doesn't account for your position in the network. And you can see in this case that we've got node that's red. It's got a higher degree, but it's actually less central in the network. So I've got some epidemic curves here. And what I want you to note is that there are some issues that we were having trouble figuring out, but you can still see some interesting dynamics. So you can see, and I'll mention this in the next slide, that contact tracing and quarantining seem to be very effective, but centrality-based isolation and epidemic size-based distancing don't do quite as well. And so from before, we can see that, yeah, our mechanism for infection still needs work because we don't see quite the behavior we'd expect. We see that actually, if you go back, reactive social distancing, we saw that there was actually some evidence for epidemic waves. You can see that there is a bump there, and we saw that in other simulations as well. And then we found that contact tracing is the most effective. However, due to the computational cost and the model being stochastic, we actually need more realizations to make firm conclusions on this. And in conclusion, we found that the intervention type can strongly affect when the epidemic peaks, as well as the epidemic size. And these approaches can all be paired. You don't have to use just one when determining the epidemic response. And in the future, we want to explore more networks to see the effect and maybe use different centrality measures. And that's all I have. Thanks.
Great, thank you. We have some time for questions, so I'll read the first one that I see here in the chat. How do you check which model works best?
That's a great question. That is a little bit outside of my expertise. We had another group member who suggested using LFR, and we consider this to be an effective model because it has a lot of the heterogeneity that you experience in a typical network, but also you can dial in the community sizes and inter-community connections.
Great. All right, are there any other questions? Okay, here we go. Olin, how are you seeding the infected nodes?
Great question. So we are seeding them randomly, and we put 25% in asymptomatic and 75% in symptomatic.
Great. Are there any other questions in the chat? All right, well, thank you so much. That was a great presentation. All right, so our next team is Asym and Dist, and I think Blake, you're the one who is sharing your screen.
That's right.
All right, so if you want to just press screen share. All right, thank you so much. So as I said, this is the team Asym and Dist, and today they'll be presenting on their work. The presentation title is Exploring the Interaction Between Asymptomaticity. Oh, I can't even say that. Blake, you say it.
Asymptomaticity and social distancing.
Ugh, that's terrible. That's the worst word ever. Asymptomaticity. Nope, can't do it. Okay, so without further ado and without me saying that word, I'll let you go, Blake.
Hi, I'm Upasana, and we are team Asym and Dist, and we are exploring the interaction between asymptomaticity and social distancing. So now that we are into this crisis for about 5 months, there are a lot of information that we have about COVID-19, but one of the central features that still continues to have a very high uncertainty is the proportion of the asymptomatic individuals. The difference between asymptomatic individuals and symptomatic individuals is that even though both of them are infected, the asymptomatic individuals do not show any signs or any symptoms of the disease, whereas symptomatic individuals do. In the slides, you can see some papers that talk about some estimates about the asymptomatic percentages. So in some papers, we see that the estimate is around 5.8%, whereas in some paper, we see that around 4/5 of all the cases are asymptomatic. And there is also estimate about the total infected individuals per diagnosed patient to be around 2.4. This is another paper that estimates that around 86% of all the transmissions are undocumented, and the estimated per person transmission rate of undocumented infections is around 55%. So in the study of this pandemic, it is important that we keep in mind this asymptomatic proportion, because they do, in fact, the amount of social distancing being practiced, because, for example, an asymptomatic person, since doesn't show symptoms and probably doesn't know that he or she is infected, doesn't practice as much social distancing compared to a symptomatic person. So our research question is to explore how the unknown proportion of asymptomatic individuals influences the reduction of the transmission rate via social distancing. The framework that we use is percolation framework. So what are percolation networks? So suppose you have a graph that is around that has around 20 nodes and about 40 edges. So to make the percolation network, we basically go through each edge of the original network and keep that edge with a probability equal to the percolation probability, and delete it otherwise. So for example, as you can see here, the percolation network thus formed consists of lesser number of edges than the original network, because for every edge in the original network, we keep it with a probability of 80% and delete it with a probability of 20%. On the other hand, if the percolation probability is decreased to 0.5, more number of edges are deleted and the resultant network has lesser number of edges. So why we are studying the percolation network is that if we produce a percolation network where the percolation probability is equal to the transmission probability, where transmission probability is basically the probability of a person infecting its neighbor, then this percolation network will basically consist of all the edges that for sure transmits the disease to the other node if either of the node at the end of the edge gets infected. Now, for an epidemic to occur, it's important that the percolation network has a giant connected component, because basically the nodes in the giant connected component of the percolated network will be the number of infected individuals in the network. So here is an example of giant connected component. You can see that the red nodes belong to a network that belong to a graph that consists of majority of the nodes of the network. In the next slide, we discussed about the role that the mean degree and the percolation probability plays in deciding the giant connected component size. So here we see an interesting thing in this plot. We have average degree in the x-axis, the size of the connected component, largest connected component in the y. We see something interesting happening around average degree equals to 1. We see a phase transition where suddenly the number of edges present in the network is just enough to create a huge giant connected component where the size is comparable to the size of the entire network. In the next plot below, you can see on the x-axis, we have percolation probability, and something interesting happens right after 0.2 when suddenly the number of edges in the percolation network is enough to have a huge giant connected component compared to the network size. So the takeaway from this slide is that it is important that we study the average degree and the percolation probability, because they decide the size of the giant component, and giant connected component actually is equivalent to the number of infected individuals during the outbreak.
Okay, so now that we understand the percolation framework is useful, how do we model asymptomatic infections? We can do this by simply assigning each new infection to be symptomatic or not according to some probability. Here, we choose to model a difference in behaviors between symptomatic and asymptomatic persons through a modified transmission rate. We assume that asymptomatic cases are more likely to spread the disease, since symptomatic persons may be more likely to isolate if they know they are sick. We're able to determine analytic results for epidemic thresholds under the following set of assumptions. First, we assume the contact network has Poisson degree distribution, as is true for Erdős-Rényi networks of large size. We specify the proportion of asymptomatic infections new, as well as the transmission rates for symptomatic and asymptomatic cases. Now, these can be combined into an expected transmission probability P, shown below. Simply multiplying this probability by the mean degree C gives us R naught, which may be interpreted as usual in the context of similar models. Similarly, we can compute a critical value for the mean degree, C critical. In the context of social distancing, this becomes a crucial threshold since we're able to manipulate the mean degree of a population to the point where long transmission chains can become unlikely when C is less than C critical. So this model tells us how the epidemic threshold changes with the proportion of asymptomatic cases and the differences in distancing behavior based on one's symptomaticity. Next, we'll be verifying analytic results through stochastic simulations. We'll be informing model parameters through observational data as it becomes available. And we'll be considering representations of social distancing in conjunction with symptomatic differences, such as through modifying degree distributions. Thank you for your time, and we look forward to your feedback.
Thank you. That was a great presentation. If anybody has any questions, they can type them into the chat. All right. Give you a few seconds more to type a question, or else we'll move on. Okay, well, oh, no, we got one. Okay, so the percolation graph is different from the Erdős-Rényi graph just because you're starting with something other than the connected network?
The percolation graph is different from the Erdős-Rényi graph because there are a lesser number of edges here. We are only keeping the edges that for sure will transmit the disease from one end to the other if either of the end is infected. I'm not sure if I actually understand your question very correctly, but yeah, that's the explanation I have about percolation graph, and let me know if that answers your question.
Okay, any other questions? All right, thank you all so much. Well, I think we can move on to the next team. Rodrigo, if you want to share your screen. We'll give you a moment to set that up.
Thank you. Coming up. Hopefully.
Everybody's been so on time. It's amazing.
Yes, it works.
It's a record. Okay.
Can you see it?
Thank you. I can. Yeah, it's perfect.
Great. All right.
All right. So we have Team TA COVID. And thank you, Rodrigo, for getting this all set up. And they'll be presenting their project entitled Effective Voluntary Distancing Measures on the Spread of COVID-19, the Case of Mexico City. All right.
Yep. All right. Thank you very much, Jennifer. So yes, this is TACOVID team. We're all part of this big effort trying to model epidemiological spreading of COVID-19, particularly in Mexico City, and I'll tell you a little bit why a little bit later. So as I was saying in the 1-minute slide, just if somebody doesn't remember so much, so the idea of this project called Effective Voluntary Distancing Measures on the Spread of COVID-19 is to evaluate or to measure how much does the cooperation of individuals affect the spreading of the disease. So if you have different individuals that do follow the instructions of keep staying at home and reducing the contact number, that the number of people that they see every day, and the people and their mobility, well, then you would expect the flattening of the curve and the diminishing number of cases at the end of the spreading. However, if there are some people who do not cooperate, and this is important to be mentioned, that it is not because they don't want to cooperate, that they don't want to obey. It is in many cases because not only what they believe, but what they can do. So there's people who have essential working functions and people who have direct impact into their family economy, so that they are not able to keep to remain at home, and for whom this keeping at home is pretty much a luxury. So what happens when you have people who cannot abide to these indications is that the spreading can continue further and further. So we wanted to know what was the effect of the fraction of cooperative individuals in the total fraction of cases. So as we would expect, if more people abide to the indications, well, the measures are hopefully going to be effective in reducing the number of cases. But if nobody abides to them, well, we expect to have more cases. But how much more cases can we expect? And how, so this is a little bit of the efficiency of implementing these measures. And we want to know how will this behave in terms of, well, if we are able to get 20% of the population to obey and to follow the indications, well, will we reduce the number of cases by 50% or by how much? So this is the aim of our study. To do this, we're focusing on Mexico. Just like Sam said about Boston, in Mexico, there has been no imposed lockdown. So people are still able to do and go around in their normal days, but they are being highly encouraged to stay at home. So depending on how much these restrictions are being followed, it can have different impacts on the spreading of the disease. And I just wanted to show here a map of the Mexico in all of the different neighborhoods that have been marked as infected or not infected. And this is the area that we will be working more on, Mexico City, particularly regarding and thinking of the importance of urban context that was mentioned by Sam earlier. So one thing we're doing is trying to put together real world data that measures mobility of the different areas of Mexico City. So how much people go to the center of the city, go back to their homes, and we have information of the real, well, not real time mobility, but from 2015 to 2017 mobility by regions in Mexico City, and we're using this information to build like a before COVID-19 mobility state. And then from this state, we're gonna simulate the implementation of these interventions, and we're gonna make them result or be similar to what is reported by Google. So here we have a little matrix prepared by Diana, one of our members, in which you have each of the different regions of Mexico City and the short-term or short-range mobility. And you can see that there's some very long-range mobility as well. So we wanted to implement this real world or real data into our project. As you can see, the mobility by Google has been classified in different aspects. So retail and recreation, grocery and pharmacy, parks and transit stations and workplaces, and residential. And you can see that in general in Mexico City, all of these areas have been received less visits, and so less mobility into those areas, and residential has been growing up. So we wanted to know how much this is enough or not enough in the context of COVID-19. To do that, we're trying to come up with a way to measure cooperativity. So what I was mentioning before about having nodes that cooperate and some others that don't, well, it is a very tricky question in terms of how do we qualify someone as being cooperative. At first, or what we have used as a starting point is that cooperative individuals are defined as those that reduce their daily mobility by more than 25%. Resulting in a group of cooperants and non-cooperants. So we really put it into two groups, and we say, okay, well, what if we have 10% of cooperants or not? And then afterwards, we're considering the possibility of measuring cooperativity in time, the changes in time. So maybe people will be more abiding during weekdays or weekends. People will be cooperative, not in a 0 or 1, but in a percentage of their time or in a percentage of their activities or their destinations. And we assume that reducing mobility will reduce the number of meetings and therefore the contagion. So in general, just to kind of wrap it up, we're trying to put together information about where people live, how many people live in which parts of the city, how much they move and how much they used to move in 2017 and how much they have changed their mobility habits from then now. And something that I was not, that I didn't stress a lot of, but we also have information about the health system charge and load currently in Mexico, including the number of cases, the date of the case report, and the evolution of the case until either recovering or death in some cases. So in general, similar to what other people have been doing, we're building a network of contacts, and we're trying to model the epidemic spread across this network. And then we're using different models. One of us, either SIR and many different modifications and alternatives of it, SEIR and so on. And then once we have modeled how this epidemic would spread in this network, we're using the topology to do a percolation approach to say, okay, well, what if these edges are removed at this point of the spreading? How will that affect the total number of cases? So we hope to get to this point in which we can tell, okay, well, taking into account real world data and temporal dynamics of the spreading, how will this be affected? So with that, I'd like to thank you.
Thank you. That was awesome.
Thanks.
Very good. If anybody has any questions, can you please type them into the chat?
Also, if any of my teammates want to add something else, I probably forgot something. Feel free.
Yes, you're very welcome. We have 4 minutes, so yeah, look at us.
Nice. Good timing.
What was the biggest challenge?
I think, well, as you can see, there's many people in the team, and that is for a particular reason. So we're trying to work on 2 aspects of the project, and one of them is the modeling aspect, in which some of us have very wide, diverse range of experience and expertise. Mm-hmm. But I think one of the challenges is, it is many times the case in data science, and that is the other half of the team work, is gathering all the data and digesting it and making it compatible with the models that we're trying to use. So one thing is to make a nice gas chamber model of this is how we think it is, but implementing and how do we quantitatively implement this real world data into our models, I think that is one of the biggest challenges. And many times, depending on the assumptions that you make and depending on how you do this, your model may not be very impactful after all, if it's not properly done. So I think that is one of the main challenges.
Very interesting. All right, any other questions or teammate additions? All right, thank you so much, Rodrigo and team. That was awesome.
Thank you.
Okay, next up we have the Games vs. COVID. I think Alex is sharing. Okay, perfect. I'll let you get in your full screen. Oh.
Okay, just getting my microphone activated.
No problem, no rush. All right, so next up we have Games vs. COVID, and they're going to be presenting a talk entitled Simulating a Social Distancing Game in NetLogo to Model Behavior in an Epidemic. So take it away.
Interesting. Okay, thank you everyone. So we are the Games vs. COVID group. We're made up of Adam, Annika, Herbod, Ben, Alex, and Lihong. And so I'm going to be talking about simulating social distancing game in NetLogo to model behavior during an epidemic. So the theory behind the sort of agent-based approach to this simulation is going to be game theory. So what is game theory? It's basically the sort of original like economic theory base for how different players in a given game will take actions depending on the cost and benefit of each of those actions, but also can be dependent on the cost and benefit of other players' actions and how those interact to produce some sort of overall best strategy. So what we're going to be looking at here is a repeated game that is being played on a network in which we have nodes in the network that are going to be acting as players and other nodes in the network that are going to be non-players that we are modeling as basically your essential workers that don't really have an option to choose a strategy relative to social distancing or not in this game. So given these players, any given node in the network, and this includes your essential and non-essential nodes, can be in one of 4 states. They can be susceptible, asymptomatic infected, symptomatic infected, and recovered. There can also be a dead state, but at that point, they are no longer in the network, so we're not considering them as being in one of those states. And each round, all of the player nodes are going to choose to take one of 3 actions. They can either socially distance, which essentially means that they are going to quote unquote remove themselves from the network and have no probability of transmission. They can not socially distance, so stay in the network as they normally would, or they can accept a sickness penalty, which is sort of the default thing that you would do if you are symptomatic infected. So we're not giving anyone the option to sort of go out when they're, you know, not able to breathe from COVID or something like that. If you are sick, then you are staying home, essentially. And so different actions in our model are going to incur different penalties and risks depending on how each player has formulated their strategy. We'll explain a little bit later, like how these risks are evaluated and like how they might affect what your strategy is. But each time that they take a different action, they can also gain different types of knowledge. So for example, if you are always social distancing, you may not necessarily know what is going on in your local social network. And so you're going to have to base your strategy on, you know, different types of knowledge. And these strategies are going to define how players choose their action to maximize their benefit according to how they see their cost and benefits. So to summarize what these costs and benefits are, we're going to look at how each of the actions affect what is going on in the network and what these players are doing, what the cost incurs, and what is the knowledge gained, and what is the knowledge that they then have available for the next action they're going to take in this repeated game. So first off, you can take the action of staying home, right? So you can distance. And that is going to incur some sort of constant cost to you. This can be interpreted as the cost of, you know, staying away from your friends, or also the cost of not being able to go to work or something like that. And this cost is going to increase relative to the number of consecutive times that you are playing this action, right? So there is a greater cost to consistent social distancing than there is to, say, just social distancing for one day. For each of these, you gain sort of a global knowledge of the network. So what that means is basically you're still able to stay home. You can watch the news. You can get a sense for what's the total number of people that are known to be infected, but you're not going to necessarily know, you know, how many of the people in your local network stayed home, how many of them were infected, or anything like that. So the next action is you can go out, you can not social distance, where you incur no cost, but you do then have the possibility of contracting the disease. And then the final action is, of course, if you're sick, you stay home and you incur a sickness cost. So the key here is that each player is trying to balance their costs in order to obtain the optimal result for them. So what are the strategies each of these agents can behave, and how are these going to affect what's going on? So we can basically sort of separate the strategies into 4 general groups. There are the no parameter strategies, which are basically the most simplistic thing that you could possibly do. There are strategies that are only explicitly dependent on time. So they're not looking at any sort of global information. They're not looking at any sort of local information. They're only doing essentially what they need to do at any given time in order to maximize what they expect their cost function will be. There are strategies that are dependent on your local network, and there are strategies that are dependent only on the global network. Okay. So using the no parameters, these are pretty straightforward. Their strategy of just never distance. You don't care if you get sick. You don't care if you get other people sick. You're just never going to distance because you like going out. And then there's also essentially random, which is much less interesting. But going on to the strategies depending only on time, these are basically, you can think of the strategies that go something like, you're just going to stay home until you incur such a cost that it is no longer possible for you to continue staying home, right? So you get so stir crazy that you can't possibly stay in your house another day, or you have run out of food or money such that you have no option of continuing to stay inside. So these are just explicitly time dependent. They don't depend on what's happening in your local network. Basically you can tune these by determining basically how much each player is able to stay inside before they must go outside. And then the other side of this is just, you can have some sort of constant factor that increases over time that is just going to determine basically a willingness factor to stay inside. And that is sort of affecting how people evaluate the risk of going out into the network. So those are the most simple ones. We can then get into some more complicated strategies that depend on the local area of the network. So these can go from sort of checking to see if a certain amount of your direct neighbors do not perform social distancing, and and how many are getting infected, and then you can act accordingly. You can also think about sort of tit for tat strategy. So like if a lot of your neighbors go out, then you will also possibly go out. But if they stay in, you will also stay in. So you're following the lead of whoever is around you. But then you can sort of have an opposite idea to that. So if a lot of people are going out, you may want to stay in because you see that as being more risky. And conversely, if not a lot of people are going out, you may think it is then safe to go out. So these are sort of different ways to think about that. But then there are finally the strategies that just depend on the whole network. So you're basing your entire strategy on what you see on the news in terms of those figures for the total number of people who you know are infected. And that is how you evaluate the risk of going out in this situation. So we'll then get on to what is our simulation model in this case, and that is NetLogo, sort of the basic way that we're going to be implementing this. So in NetLogo, the disease spreads by essentially, given a round, the epidemic module will see the network of people who are still involved, so it's people who are still not social distancing. And then there is a probability that given the interactions between different nodes or players in the network, that they will contract a disease from someone who is infected. And a player can only know if they have been infected if they develop symptoms. So that is not going to be factored into how they're evaluating risk or things like that. And essential workers, so those essential nodes are always in the network. They don't have the option to remove themselves even if they get infected. So just see if I can play a little bit of an example model here. This is from the NetLogo models library where we're looking at a virus on a network. Oh, that didn't play. Not sure if I'm able to play this. But anyways, this is sort of the basic model that we're looking at, which is sort of a virus spreading on this distance associated network. What we're more interested in is using something like a small world network, which is a more realistic scenario for what a social network is going to look like. These networks, for those who aren't aware, are characterized by having a very low sort of average degree, but have a also relatively low mean path distance between any given node in the network. So those are the ones we're most interested in doing this modeling on. And finally, the plan, at least for now, is to adapt a previous piece of code that had been developed for this system by Li Hong that is looking at different vaccination strategies to now account for different, essentially, player strategies in this game theory setting. So those are the things we're currently working on. Don't have any results to show yet, but hopefully in the future we will. And I think that is it for our presentation. So thank you very much for listening, and welcome any questions anyone has.
Great, thank you so much. That was awesome. If anybody has any questions, they can type them into the chat box. All right. Oh, okay. So we have one question, and by Olin, maybe I missed this, but are you randomly selecting the essential workers?
So our original plan is to randomly select the essential workers, but we've also discussed possibly doing some selection based on like a degree distribution. So possibly weighting workers with a higher degree in the network as being more likely to be essential. But as of now, I think we're just looking at doing it randomly. So having a certain proportion of essential versus non-essential workers.
Okay, great. And I think Rodrigo, you had a question. Oh, that was his question. Okay, great. So I think those are all the questions that we had. Just a reminder to go to the discussion session if you would like to, and to give us your feedback that I just posted in the chat. All of these presentations were really wonderful, and it's been just an honor to watch all of this happen. So thank you all for putting so much work into this and making these amazing projects. This has been awesome.